And today, we are honored to have Mr. Chen Chang from the Australian National University. Chang is a PhD scholar. I think that he's very at the very final stage of the PhD, and also the research officer who has done a lot of work on energy modeling and especially energy storage. And he recently has published in high-ranking journals on some works in the Southeast Asia as well as Asia about energy storage and interconnections. So I'm sure that Mr. Chang will have a lot to share with us today on this important topic. And also we will have Tarek as a facilitator as always. For the Q&A, when you want to raise your questions, please raise your visual hands first so we can see you and unmute you, and you can and raise your question by yourself. The other way is writing the questions in the chat box. And of course, we also have the policy, the discussion forum for you to discuss or give any remaining questions later. Okay, so without any further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Chang to deliver the session on energy storage. So over to you.
Right, thank you, Tom. Thanks very much for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor to be here with you today, and yeah, I look forward to being able to talk about energy storage. So I will just share my slides. Can I just confirm that everybody can see my slides? Yes, okay, great. So here's the agenda today. So first, I will briefly introduce why we need storage, why is it important in future energy systems, and then we will cover three types of energy storage: pumped hydro, battery, and hydrogen. Most of my research is around modeling of pumped hydro and its role in supporting high penetration of renewable energy in electricity systems. So I will put a little bit more emphasis on pumped hydro, but because that's what I'm most familiar with. But I will also talk about the basics of battery and hydrogen and their potential applications. So now let's dive in. First, why do we need storage? So this graph shows the global electricity generation capacity addition per year for different technologies. And it's clear that solar photovoltaics and wind now account for over half of the global generation capacity additions. And the biggest reason to that is the large cost reduction over the past decade. As you can see here, solar, PV, and wind are now cheaper than fossil fuels in terms of electricity generation in most countries. And solar, PV, and wind will only become more and more important in the global electricity networks. Because if you consider other clean technologies, hydro, for example, deployment of new hydro is limited by the number of undammed rivers and some environmental pushbacks, and deployment of new nuclear, bioenergy, geothermal, and concentrated solar power CSP continues at low levels compared with solar and wind. It's really difficult to imagine these technologies bridging the large gap to solar PV and wind in terms of the global annual deployment rates. And indeed, it's really difficult to see any timely solution to climate change that does not involve solar and wind doing most of the heavy lifting. And if you look at where are the emissions from, you can see from this pie chart that nearly 3/4 of global emissions are energy related due to our energy use in buildings, in transport and industry. So the energy sector really needs to be the primary focus on our journey to net zero. And currently a fraction of this energy use is electricity, which is generated in a variety of ways, clean or non-clean, but the rest is from direct combustion of fossil fuels. For example, the use of gas for space and water heating, the use of oil or gasoline for transport, And the rapid and continued cost reduction of solar PV and wind have led to the wide deployment of renewables globally, as we just seen. That enables the decarbonization of not only the electricity sector, but the entire energy sector. So one pathway to decarbonize the entire energy sector is to first electrify everything that could be electrified. For example, if we can replace the gas heaters in our homes with electric heat pumps, replace the conventional internal combustion engine vehicles with electric vehicles, and replace blast furnaces with electric arc furnaces. So when all these end uses are now powered by electricity, and all that electricity is generated by renewable energy, solar PV and wind, for example, we could achieve a zero emission energy sector. But of course, there are sectors that are difficult to be directly electrified, aviation and shipping, for example. But we will discuss these in detail later when we talk about hydrogen. However, the challenge is the variable nature of solar and wind. The time when the solar and wind electricity is available is not necessarily the time when the demand needs to be met. So what happens when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing? So in a future electricity grid with high level of solar and wind, you need additional balancing mechanisms to make sure that the generation can meet the demand in every hour or every minute or even every second. And the measures to balance solar and wind include flexible generation, like hydroelectricity, which can be turned on when required to fill the gap between the supply and the demand. Storage, you can store excess electricity when the generation is higher than the demand, and the stored energy can be later recovered when the generation is not sufficient to meet the demand. In interconnection, you can connect the regions that are hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away by high voltage transmission that can smooth out the local demand and local weather. And lastly, demand response, for example, load shedding or load shifting during occasional periods of low solar PV availability. And the lowest cost solution is often an optimal combination of several of these measures, but storage will be the key and will be the focus of today's session. So that brings us to the first storage technology that we will cover in this section, pumped hydro. So first, how does pumped hydro work? So essentially, it consists of two reservoirs with different altitude, and the altitude difference is what we usually call the head. And the two reservoirs are connected by a pipe or a tunnel. So pumped hydro is essentially the reversing of a turbine to become a pump so that the water can be pumped from a lower reservoir to an upper reservoir when there is abundant solar and wind. And in the night when the wind is not blowing, you can then allow the water to come back down the pipe through the turbine to recover most of the electricity, just like how a conventional hydroelectricity works. And about 20% of the energy is lost in the round trip. This graph from ARENA International Renewable Energy Agency shows the global operational storage power capacity for different technologies. And you can see that pumped hydro completely dominates the market. It's about 96% of all storage power and 99% of all storage energy. Most of the balancing comes from batteries. So pumped hydro is a mature storage solution, so the cost is known and reliable. And this is a photograph of a conventional on-river pumped hydro storage. It has a head of 150 meters. That means it's 150 meters altitude difference between the upper and the lower reservoir, which is on the low side. It's relatively low head. The water volume is 6 gigaliters, and the combined reservoir area is 19 square kilometers, and the power rating is about 1.5 gigawatts. So this is an river-based pumped hydro, but off-river pumped hydro is an alternative. There is no river in sight. So this is a good example from Italy. The head or the altitude difference between the upper and the lower reservoir is now 500 meters, similar water volume to the previous with 6 gigaliters, combined reservoir area is just 1 square kilometer, which is 19 times smaller than the previous on-river system. It's got a gigawatt hour rating, and you can run it with 1 gigawatt for 6 hours flat out. So comparing off-river and on-river pumped hydro energy storage, there are vastly more off-river sites, 100 times as many, because 99% of the Earth's surface is not close to a river, and the reservoir are smaller compared to the on-river system, so much faster construction. And there's minimal environmental or social impact because there's no interference to existing rivers or lakes. And consequently, there are low or zero flood control cost because, again, you are not on the river. And importantly, for off-river pumped hydro, the heads are typically better because you can double the head by putting the upper reservoir not in the river valley, but on top of the hill. And if you double the head, you double the power and you double the energy storage, but you don't double the cost. So large head is important for reducing the overall cost of the storage, but we'll talk more about the cost very shortly. And it's worth pointing out that off-river pumped hydro is basically for daily storage. So if you consider a system, a reservoir with 100 hectares, a pair of reservoir with 100 hectares, each with 25 meters deep, with a 500 meter head, and they can operate at 2 gigawatts for 12 hours. So if you want a seasonal storage, then the on-river system, which is much larger, is probably a better way to go. So in 2019, our team at the ANU carried out a global assessment of viable off-river pumped hydro sites using geographic information system analysis. And we found 616,000 off-river pumped hydro sites with a combined storage potential of 23 million gigawatt hours. And the latitude range covered in the global survey is from 60 degrees north to 56 degrees south, and urban areas and protected areas are excluded from the survey. So you can go to the Global Pumped Hydro Atlas, you can zoom, you can pan, you can look in your backyard, you can look in a place that you know well to investigate how it all fits together. So in the Global Atlas, each site is categorized into a cost class based on its characteristics. So if you look at here, Class A sites are the cheapest, and Class B all the way through Class E sites are 25% increments in cost above Class A sites. And the pumped hydro schemes were simulated with storage capacities ranging from 2 gigawatt hour to 5, 15, 50, and 150 gigawatt hour, and the power to operate for either 6 hours or 18 hours at full capacity. And from this graph, you can see the contribution of the 660,000 sites to the total resource globally. So basically, the larger the system, if you look at 150 gigawatt hour system, they contribute more to the total capacity than the smaller systems. And so the average system capacity around the world is about 40 gigawatt hour. And if you look at the distribution of the sites across the cost class, it actually changes with the increased storage capacity. So if you look at Class A and Class B, that contains the largest proportion of the 150 gigawatt hour sites, while if you look at the smaller sites, it's dominated by Class D and Class E sites. So the general trend is that the larger the system, the more economical it is, although there are exceptions. And also the sites are widely distributed around the world. In each of the 17 United Nations sub-regions, the identified potential is more than required to support 100% renewable electricity systems. The target is around 20 gigawatt hour per million people based on our previous modeling for Australia. And in most regions, the potential is 50 times more than that. And this is an example of Southeast Asia, and Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam have a total of nearly 40,000 sites. And all three countries have over 1,000 gigawatt hour of storage potential per million people. This is a lot of storage and much more than needed to support 100% renewable electricity grid in these three countries. And around 20% of the storage potential is from the lowest cost Class A sites. And you can see from the map that there is a large number of dots. The redder the dot, the lower the cost this particular pumped hydro system is. So the dark red dots are Class A sites, and the light yellow dots are Class E sites. You can zoom in to see the upper and lower reservoirs. The upper reservoir is light blue, and the dark blue is the lower reservoir. You can see the tunnel road connecting the two reservoirs, and you can even see the location of the dam wall and exactly what areas of the land will be flooded. You can pan, you can zoom, you can click on either the reservoir or the tunnel road to get some wealth information about the system and the system components. So this is an example of a 50 gigawatt hour system in Kalimantan, Indonesia. It is a Class B site with 800 meters of head. When you click on the tunnel road, it shows key attributes of the pair, for example, the head, the separation between the two reservoirs, the average slope, etc. And here are another two examples of the site in Philippines and in Vietnam. They both have 50 gigawatt hour storage capacity with 6 hours of storage. When you click on the upper reservoir or the lower reservoir, you can see the detailed information of that reservoir. For example, the coordinate where it is located, the area of the reservoir, the volume of the reservoir, the elevation, and also information about the dam. So moving on to the cost, the capital cost. So the cost of off-river pumped hydro is dominated by the capital cost, and the capital cost can be approximately divided into an energy cost and a power cost. So the energy cost is pretty much the cost of the two reservoirs, and the power cost is the cost of the water conveyance, the machine hull, the pump, and the turbine, a generator, and the substation. So the energy cost and the power cost of the pumped hydro can be sized independently. And starting with the energy cost. So the energy cost is dominated by the cost of moving the rock to form the reservoirs, and the amount of energy stored is proportional, to the head and the usable volume of the water, the usable water volume of the reservoirs. So if we consider this on a per unit basis or a per gigawatt hour basis, the energy cost of the pumped hydro will depend on the head, the water to rock ratio. So the water to rock ratio is the ratio of the water impounded to the rock required to form the reservoir walls. So if you double the head or you double the water to rock ratio, they both approximately half the effective cost of energy. And the power cost is dominated by the cost of the high pressure pipe or tunnel that connects the two reservoirs. So ideally, we wanted the pipe or the tunnel to be short and steep, and a doubled power rating will require a pipe with a larger cross-sectional area, obviously, to convey double the volume of the water per second. But the cost increase less than proportionally. So a doubled head will, on the other hand, half the flow of the water for a given power rating, so therefore reduce the cost of the pipe or the tunnel. So in summary, for the power cost, large head, large power rating, and small effective separation of the reservoirs is ideal. So this graph shows the capital cost of typical 1 gigawatt hour of river pump hydro system with different energy storage volume, different head, different slope, and water to rock ratio. So you can clearly see how these factors affect the capital cost of the system. And for the levelized cost of storage, in addition to the capital costs, you also need to consider other factors like the operation and maintenance costs, the revenue from selling the electricity, the price you pay to buy the electricity, the losses in the energy storage cycle, and the system lifetime and the discount rate. So if you consider this, if one system cycles twice as often per year compared to another system, then the capital cost is spread over twice the volume of the cells. So the levelized cost of energy storage is approximately halved, as you can see from this graph here. So the levelized cost of storage in this context means the average difference between the purchase price of electricity you use to pump the water to the upper reservoir and the required selling price of the energy from the storage. So the required selling price is obviously higher than the purchase price to cover the capital and the operational costs over the system lifetime, and also to cover the round trip energy storage energy losses. And it's important to understand that the land and the water requirements of pumped hydro to support variable solar and wind generation are small. So we've looked at Australia as an example, and in Australia, you will need about 3 meters square per person of reservoir area to support a 100% renewable electricity system, but based mostly on variable solar and wind. And this is much smaller than the area of the land required for the solar and the wind farms that the pumped hydro supports. And the water requirement is also small. It's about 3 to 10 liters per person per day. And this is pretty much for the initial fill up, to fill up the reservoirs and also to make up the losses of the water evaporation. And it's in Australia's hot, dry climate. And this is really small quantities of water in the overall scheme of things. And they're pretty much a lot smaller than the amount of water required for a traditional coal-based power system, because there's no cooling towers. And this is something you probably know better than me. There were not a lot of pumped hydro projects in Indonesia, Philippines, or Vietnam, but there are proposals to build such systems to support higher fraction of renewables in the grid. So it's really nice to see this momentum, and I'm expecting to see more projects coming in the next couple of decades. So a brief summary of pumped hydro energy storage. First, it is the lowest cost, mature, large storage solution that is well suited to balance variable generation from solar and wind. And secondly, there are vast numbers of potential off-river sites, far more than what is needed to support 100% renewable energy systems. And off-river pumped hydro uses completely standard technology, but largely mitigates the environmental and social impact associated with the conventional river-based systems. All right, now before we move to the next storage technology, does anyone have any questions so far regarding pumped hydro? Please feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat.
I don't see any questions in the chat there or any hands raised, Cheng. I do have one question to ask. With pumped hydro, you found these phenomenal number of sites around the world, at 616,000 sites. Yeah. What kind of site considerations do you have when you're selecting which are a good site for pumped hydro? What are the kind of considerations that you take into when you were identifying the sites?
That's a great question. So basically, for this global survey, we were considering Turkey nest set. So first, the terrain needs to follow a specific characteristics so that you can hold a significant amount of water to form the reservoirs. And then you also need to consider how tall the dams are, because the dam walls cannot be indefinitely tall. We set an upper bound. I cannot remember what's the exact number, but it's 80 meters to 100 meters. So that's an upper bound. And also, so basically we set a specific pumped hydro site, as you see from the previous slide, ranging from 2 gigawatt hour all the way to 150 gigawatt hour. So one particular location might be suitable, for example, might be suitable for a small pumped hydro site, but may not be suitable for a large pumped hydro site. So basically, that's the process we go through to find if there are potential sites. But I need to mention that in this survey, all protected areas, all urban areas are removed, so there will be minimal environmental and social impact.
There's another question relating to the pumped hydro sites from John Cotton at the ETP Secretariat. So he's asking, what is the source of water for the off-river sites?
That's a great question. So the source, we didn't look specifically into how you get the water for the pumped hydro, but I need to mention that the amount of water you need is very small, because in a traditional fossil-based system, you will need water for the cooling towers, and you need significantly less water for pumped hydro. So you can get water from anywhere you want, but in the global atlas, we've been only focusing on so both the upper and lower reservoirs are artificial, and we are not looking at sea-based pumped hydro, so it's not salt water. So yeah, I think that's a good question. We didn't particularly look into where the water will come from, but I don't think that will be a very difficult issue in the future electricity grid.
So is it rainfall you're talking when you're talking about water, or you're actually bringing water to the site?
You will need to bring water to the site for the initial fill, but after that, the evaporation and the rainfall will balance for most regions. In some very hot, dry climates, you probably need to add a few more water during the operational lifetime of the pumped hydro to fill up the gap between the evaporation and the rainfall. But in most places, that's balanced out, because there are a lot of technologies to help to reduce evaporation.
Okay, we're starting to get a few questions, so I'll keep asking the ones that are in the chat, but if anybody wants to ask their question directly, please do raise your hand. And Ms. Tien is looking out for hands, and she'll unmute you as your hands are raised. So a couple of questions about performance of pumped hydro for you, Cheng. One is about the cost-efficient structural materials. What cost-efficient structural materials could be best for hydro systems to help reduce the energy cost?
That's a good question. So a question that we didn't actually look into, I guess that's a question for civil engineering, if I'm understanding correct, because our work is pretty much modeling pumped hydro's role in supporting the electricity grid. So we don't know too much about how to actually build the pumped hydro. Where are the materials from? What type of concrete you need? But I think there will be a lot of resources online in terms of the structural materials required, because pumped hydro is it's a very old technology, and it's been around for over 100 years. And even off-river pumped hydro is still the same technology as the traditional river-based pumped hydro. So I would say it's a very established technology. So definitely a lot of information online. So I'd encourage you to check them out.
Yep. Okay. I think a slightly, coming back to the performance side of things, some question about the pricing. So what causes the increase in the price between the categories A, B, and C that you were showing earlier on the graph?
Yeah, that's a good question. So because when we were doing when we were looking for the potential sites, we set a specific pumped hydro site. And then for different systems, they will have different areas, different volumes, or different heads to be able to meet that specific pumped hydro site. So for example, if you consider two sites, both with the same power and energy rating, 50 gigawatt hour with 6 hours of storage, for example, if one site is located in a terrain where you can build a very small reservoir, a reservoir with a small surface area, you will need a large head to be able to have to store the same amount of, to have the same energy storage capacity. So that large head, as I've introduced earlier, will therefore reduce the cost. So it actually depends on the terrain. So how large you can have, how large you can build the reservoir, how tall the dam walls needs to be at. It also depends on the water to rock ratio. So in some places, you only need a small amount of civil engineering work to remove the rock to form the reservoirs, but in other places you need a lot of that work to store the same amount of water. So that's they all affect the cost of the pump hydro. But in summary, the larger the head, the lower the cost, and also you want to have high water to rock ratio.
Okay. And we have Mr. Ahmad Bordani from Indonesia has raised his hand. So Tien, if you could unmute Ahmad and let him ask his question.
Okay, thank you, Tariq. Thank you, Chen, for the remarkable presentations. Ahmad Bordani from Indonesia, actually from one of the electric company in Indonesia, PLN. So yeah, I really like the data that you showed us that about the Southeast Asia potential of the reservoir and also as well as the hydro pump storage for that. So I have two questions here. The first one, that in your presentation, the function of the hydro pump storage is for the load shifting, right? So you pump the water from our reservoir to the upper reservoir where generation is higher than the demand, or we can say that where the price at the electricity at the time is very cheap, right? And then vice versa. And then how in this course, of course, we try to use this purpose of what we call the value stream of the hydro pump storage itself and the storage itself to mitigate the intermittency of the renewable energy. So can we then use simultaneously or we call it parallelly while we do load shifting? We can also do like frequency regulations for the what we call energy pump storage here. Yeah. So what do you see about this? This is the first question. Not only load shifting but also the frequency regulation. The second one is we all know that we are in a tropical area, right? Dry season and also rainy seasons. In my experience, controlling or operating like 3 cascade of a reservoir in West Java and the largest cascade in Indonesia. So we really rely on the inflow where it comes from the rain itself. Sometimes we cannot predict the rain. Sometimes there is a really long dry seasons when at that time we don't have much to do with our pump storage, with our hydropower plants. How do you see this what we call challenge in hydro pump storage? How to then mitigate it? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the questions. I think both questions are amazing. So just regarding the first question, that's a great question. So a lot of people think that the main role of pump hydro is to provide daily storage, as I've just described. During the daytime when we have excess solar, we store that in pump hydro, and during the nighttime we recover that stored energy. So that's the primary function of pump hydro. But pump hydro also can provide a lot of ancillary services, like frequency control. It has a very fast response, only a couple of seconds. But usually you will probably need to compress air so that the water is right on top of the turbine, so that when there's a signal, then you then release the water through the turbine to generate the power to be able to do the frequency control. And also pump hydro has the system inertia because it's a turbine that's rotating. So when the generator fails, that still provides the power for a few seconds to allow the system to respond. And the pump hydro also has black start capability, which means that in the case that the entire grid fails, there's no electricity. You do not need electricity to be able to start the entire system. You can just release water through the turbine so that it can provide energy. So pump hydro can also provide a lot of ancillary services, and that's what a lot of people are not aware of. And regarding the second question, it's a good question regarding how you get the water for the initial fill. Actually, one of our colleagues, David, he's from Indonesia, and he's working on a study to look for individual off-river pumped hydro sites in Indonesia. And he looked at a couple, and if I recall correctly, his conclusion was that you could capture rainfall at a site that's right next to the pumped hydro, or you could capture rainfall in the pumped hydro site, but the amount of rainfall that could be captured is far less than the amount of water required for the initial fill. So I guess you probably need to consider transport the water from somewhere else to the pumped hydro to be able to fill the reservoir for the first time. But after that, the rainfall will and the evaporate. In the case of Southeast Asia, the rainfall is likely to be more than the evaporation, so you don't need to worry too much about that. And usually, the cost to transport water to the pumped hydro for the initial fill is included in the capital cost of the pumped hydro.
Okay, so that was factored in your calculations, the cost of transporting the water. Yes, that was a couple of questions in there about that in the chat. Cheng, maybe if there's time for just one more question before, I know you have to move on to the other sections of your presentation. Sure. So I'm keeping track of all the questions here, but if I just ask one more, and then I'll see if we have time for the other questions later. So one question was about, of course, you compared the off-river pumped hydro with the on-river pumped hydro. And what happens though when you have it? There's a question about kind of retrofitting existing hydropower plants to operate as pumped hydro. So how does the economic viability of how does the economic viability compare to creating new off-river pumped hydro versus adapting the current storage hydro plants that aren't set up for pumping? Is there an efficiency to be gained there?
That's a great question. So the efficiency are pretty similar. The efficiency of the pumped hydro weather. So you are talking about the blue field, which means that the lower reservoir or the upper reservoir is actually on the river. So it's really the retrofitting of the existing hydro project. And so our off-river pumped hydro is greenfield, which means both of the two reservoirs, the upper and the lower reservoir, are artificial. They are newly built. We are actually now just working on a global survey of bluefield sites, which means one of the reservoirs is an existing river or a lake. And our initial results suggest that these systems are not as economic as the greenfield sites, which you made the two reservoirs yourselves. Because for the greenfield sites, the areas and of the reservoirs are much, much smaller. Because you do not need to build up to find a site near a river, so you can utilize the altitude difference of a mountain or a hill, so you can have a much larger head. So it's very difficult for us to find a Class A or Class B site that's utilizing existing river-based system. But if you consider the cost of constructing the existing cost of constructing the hydro system, which you've already spent, the additional cost to add an upper reservoir on top of that might be smaller than the cost to construct an entirely new system.
Okay, well, there's a few other questions, but I'll take note of them and maybe I'll and ask them, try and fit them into the next session as well, Cheng.
Sounds good. We should have plenty of time for discussion at the end of everything. Okay, I will then move on. So everyone can still see my slides, right? Okay, so in the second part of this session, we will talk about battery storage. So in the previous session, we've talked about the role of pumped hydro can play in providing, storage to allow us to balance variable generation from solar and wind, and to achieve energy reliability and energy security in our power system. I'm now going to talk a bit about how other forms of storage, particularly battery storage, are able to complement pumped hydro. So obviously in the presentation we've just heard, we've talked a lot about pumped hydro energy storage. And the reason for that is that it is a very mature technology. And if you look around the world at the moment, you will see that overwhelmingly the amount of storage that we actually have in our electricity grid and electricity system is predominantly provided by pumped hydro. But on the flip side of that, though, we're starting to see an increasing uptake of other forms of energy storage, particularly battery storage, with lithium batteries as a very significant amount in that category. So that's really been driven by the uptake of electric vehicles. So importantly, the batteries that are in electric vehicles are lithium batteries. So when we start to look at these other forms of energy storage alongside pumped hydro, as I said, we see batteries, particularly lithium batteries. There are other interesting forms of storage that are available. So things like flywheels, compared air energy storage, and certainly some of the pre-readings we made available for this energy storage session. There was a chapter written by Professor Lachlan Blackhall from the ANU for the book around energy transition. So if you're interested in other forms of energy storage, I definitely encourage you to have a look at that chapter that we shared with you, because it does provide quite a lot of coverage outside of pumped hydro and batteries and into other forms of storage. Although looking forward, we are going to see pumped hydro and battery storage as the dominant mechanism for providing energy storage in our electricity system. So when we start to think about, the type of storage that are available, it's really interesting to think about the characteristics of that storage. So what you can see on this slide is a comparison of different forms of, chemicals, the battery and kinetic storage. So pumped hydro is an obvious technology on the kinetic side. So if you look at the axis on this plot, you see that we are comparing the power rating, which is the rate at which the energy can be delivered, and the energy capacity that we can actually store within our energy storage mechanism. So if you look at the pumped hydro, it tends to rate, very significantly, both on the power and on the energy capacity. But obviously, it's relatively large scale form of storage. If we then sort of compare that with various forms of battery storage that we can see on this left-hand side, we see that, battery storage is very complementary to pumped hydro, and that typically has slightly lower power and slightly smaller energy capacity. But that's directly related to the size of the batteries themselves. And so we tend to see utility scale storage that tends to be in that tens or hundreds of megawatts when compared to the average pumped hydro that we tend to see that's often up to 1 gigawatt or gigawatt hour range. So as we've seen in many other technologies, particularly solar PV, what we've seen over the last decade has been a very significant decline in the cost of battery storage. And so, battery storage is now becoming one of the really dominant energy storage that we're seeing in our grid. So as the cost comes down and it becomes very cost effective to deploy, and that becomes the reason that and that in turn leads to continued deployment of battery, but particularly driven by the use of lithium storage in electric vehicles. And we can see that the various use of battery storage we will have in our power systems, the lithium batteries in particular, they can have high power and reasonable amount of storage capacity for the scale of storage that we're talking about. Because of the various size that they can have, they can actually be spread over a wide geography and can be put in many places in the grid where we actually need them. And I think one of the big benefits of batteries is that because in many cases they are modular, so using battery storage becomes quite scalable. So we can start to deploy storage in small amounts and obviously continue then to expand the scale of that battery storage into our grid as we need it. And again, that becomes relevant when we start to think about some of the places when we are installing storage. So if you're in Australia, we are installing in people's homes, We are installing in people's suburbs. We are installing it at utility scale and next to the wind and solar farms. And so when you think about it from that perspective, the fact that battery storage is modular is very beneficial. And thinking about how we will deploy it over time to support this transition of our electricity system to a system that's largely renewable powered. So I'm going to touch very briefly on some of the battery chemistries that you come across. So I'm by no means a chemist, so please forgive me the fact that I'll talk about this at a relatively high level. So certainly I'd encourage you, if you're after more information about any of these chemistries, to get in touch with us through the forms that you've got access to, but also to consult the literature. And there's obviously very significant amount of literature about all these different chemistries. So one of the first types of battery storage that was deployed and actually has been around now for close to 160 years is the lead acid battery. And so, for many of us, we would see these batteries typically in our cars, not so much in our power systems. There have been installations. There has been use of lead acid batteries in the power system, but particularly in off-grid and remote installations rather than in grid connected applications. So one of the challenges about the lead acid battery is that it actually has a very shallow depth of discharge, and it actually doesn't like to be fully charged either. So lead acid batteries really like to operate between 30 to 70% of their state of charge, and any more or less that tends to damage the cell. So one of the challenges for the lead acid chemistry is that the nameplate rating of the energy storage, we actually only get to use about 40% of that. So in particular, energy applications where we are trying to shift significant amount of energy from one time to another, we would tend to find that the lead acid battery is not a good choice. And as a consequence, we won't see a lot of lead acid batteries connected to our power systems going forward. And I've already touched on the very significant role that lithium batteries play in the grid. And because of that, the high power to energy is relatively lightweight compared to other forms of storage. Lithium batteries are going to be a very dominant form of energy storage in our electricity grid globally going forward. And one of the interesting things about lithium batteries is again, because there's so much research and development going on to support the uptake of electric vehicles, we are seeing various different types of lithium chemistries. And there is still a very significant amount of innovation to head in the development of other types of lithium chemistries. And the other form of storage that probably doesn't get as much coverage as it should, but will increasingly play a very significant role in empowering our electricity and energy systems going forward is flow batteries. So, particularly chemistries like the vanadium flow battery, which was actually invented here in Australia, they are probably commercially less mature. So they've had significant amount of research, but not as much commercial development. And certainly they are manufactured far smaller scale than lithium batteries. And the upside of flow batteries, though, is that they tend to have longer lifetimes. They tend to be easily replenished. So you might have a battery that lasts for 20 years, for example, but after 20 years, you can actually flush the electrolyte and effectively recharge that electrolyte by processing it. And then the electrolyte can be fed back to the battery. So there are quite an effective means of having storage that will have a very, very long lifetime. And I should mention that pumped hydro usually have a 60 years of lifetime, and most types of battery have between 20 to 30 years of lifetime. The challenge with the flow batteries, as with many other forms of batteries, is that they often contain materials which are not particularly environmental friendly. So a broad challenge for all types of battery storage is actually going to be how we ensure that we can recycle and reuse batteries so that we don't allow the battery materials to simply go straight to the waste at the end of their lifetime. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now about some of the applications of battery storage. So this battery, I'm not sure if you can see clearly from the background image, is known as the Honsdale Reserve, and it is based next to the Honsdale Wind Farm down in South Australia. It was actually built in 2017, and after we had a very significant storm, actually damaged our grid in South Australia. And so at that time, there were questions around whether or not we would actually be able to build and operate an 100% renewable grid. And so some of the responses that the government at that time took was to actually install this battery storage next to the wind farm. And it has proven, demonstrated globally that the role of battery storage can actually play supporting the way our electricity grid work. So one of the really interesting roles that battery storage can play is that it allows us to regulate the frequency of our energy system. And so this frequency regulation is actually a requirement of our power system. And historically, frequency regulation has been provided by coal-fired or other thermal, other thermal generation. If you look at the image on the left-hand side, you can actually see a typical response from a coal-fired power plant. So the set point that is being requested, you see here is the red line, and that the sort of darker line is the response of the generation unit. So the conventional steam turbine powered by coal, and you can see here it follows along the general trend that has been requested here, but isn't being able to precisely achieve the set point that's been asked for. And on the right-hand side, you can see the equivalent response from the Honsdale power from the battery. And what's really interesting, obviously, is how precisely the battery is able to actually follow the FCAS regulation response here. So the FCAS, we touched on that briefly in the Q&A before. That stands for the Frequency Control Ancillary Service. So it's the mechanisms by which we are able to regulate the frequency. So this stood out as very early, actually, demonstration globally of the role that battery storage can play in supporting renewables, but also actually ensuring that we have, electricity grids that remain secure as we transition to a grid with significant amount of renewables. And the other place that we are seeing a lot of storage is people installing battery storage in their homes. From 2016 in Australia, we've started to see people installing residential battery storage. So people have been driven to install storage because they are keen to, to capture the solar that's on their roof. Because in Australia, we have very significant uptake of solar PV. In fact, we have the highest per capita adoption of solar PV of anywhere in the world. And so to understand the role that the residential battery storage can play, our researchers at the ANU have done some interesting analysis around the next gen battery storage program, which is a battery storage program that has been rolled out in the Australian Capital Territory where we are based. So on the left-hand side, you can see when we have very significant periods of demand, so particularly in winter, you can see that a significant demand in the morning and in the evening. And now, in contrast, if you compare that to the image on the right-hand side, you can see that when we have the most amount of solar generation. And so the obvious thing that you see here is that actually we have quite a significant mismatch between when we have solar generation during the day and actually when people are using most energy, which is basically in the morning and in the evening. So one of the things that we are able to do well when people buy residential storage is that they actually be able to charge up their battery during the day when the sun is up, and then use that energy at night, or even store it overnight for reuse in the next morning. So this is obviously a really attractive benefit to run to the customers who are quite passionate about the fact that they are generating solar and then be able to use their solar as they see it to actually power their own homes. And the other benefit, obviously, for the customers is that they're actually capturing solar during the day. So they are also able to not draw energy from the grid at night when the power prices are high. So in that way, there are also economic benefits that customers are seeing through purchasing residential storage. And another type of storage I just wanted to highlight is obviously, electric vehicles themselves. So when we started the talk, we were talking about how the uptake of lithium batteries has really been driven by the uptake of electric vehicles, because we have so much energy storage in these vehicles. And it's really important to think about how we can leverage that storage for the benefits of the system as a whole. And so, for example, we're actually using electric vehicles from our local government in order to participate in the FCAS market, which I talked a little bit about previously. And so, in this way, we're starting to think about, as we integrate electric vehicles into the energy system can also benefit from that integration. And one of the interesting studies we actually did with EVs was we modeled 100% electrified land transport in Australia. We created various charging scenarios. As you can see here, that the baseline scenario is called end of trip scenario, which assumes sufficient charging infrastructure and people will just plug in and start charging after each trip. So this profile is entirely based on the historical traveling patterns. We also have the end of day charging scenarios, which we call the worst scenario. It is designed to test the system under extreme conditions. So we assume that all charging happens during the evening peak. So you can see this profiles for 2 days. One is a weekday followed by a weekend. And we also have utility controlled charging. So, sorry. So in these scenarios, we assume that there's a central agent that controls the state of charge of all the vehicles and the consumption across the network to match these target profiles. And we model a continuous flat charging profile that spreads charging evenly throughout the day and the night, and a daytime charging scenario that utilizes the PV availability during the day, and a nighttime charging scenario that fills the evening valleys in the baseline demand. So here you can see that the electrified land transport demand plotted on top of the historical electricity demand for various scenarios. This is for Australia. So this way, charging the electric vehicles in the way that benefits the network is called load shifting. And another potential application you probably have heard of is vehicle to grid or vehicle to home. So when you use your EV battery to provide energy back to the grid or to power your home, an interesting point is that the electric vehicles could act as a virtual distribution network. So in that they will allow us to actually move a very significant amount of energy between places. So for example, you might drive into your workplace, and then when you are there, you charge up your car, but then at night, you grab back home, and then with your EV battery nearly full, so then you are able to power some of your house from the energy you transported home in your past. But the use of vehicle to grid would require the consumer, the car manufacturer, the charger manufacturer, the local electrician, the electricity market operator to act in concert. Currently, most EV manufacturers do not have vehicle to grid capabilities, with Nissan the main exception. and most EV chargers are only capable of one direction operation. And Tesla, one of the world's largest EV manufacturers, report that it sees little value of vehicle to grid. And the cost of vehicle to grid in terms of battery degradation is also an important factor, given that the battery cost dominates the cost of electric vehicles. And there has also been very little work undertaken to address the social aspect of vehicle to grid, because if we think about how should the EV owners be compensated, how much rent should be left in the car to keep them comfortable. So there's definitely more work to do around that. And the final point that I just wanted to point it out to touch on is the fact that in many grids globally, we are actually seeing a transition away from thermal generation, so away from coal-fired and gas-fired power plants. And some of the challenges we do face, we also discussed that before, is that those large synchronous machines exit the system. We still need to ensure that there's a source of system inertia and system strength. So inertia and system strength ultimately play a very important role in ensuring that we have frequency and voltage stability in our grid. So we are starting to see now earlier deployment of battery storage that actually allow us to provide inertia and system strength through batteries, through the inverters that connect the battery storage into the grid. And also, as that discussed earlier, pump hydro can also provide some of that system inertia. And also, we can see that existing battery systems is actually very capable of providing this inertia and system strength alongside all other important roles of battery. So we have every reason to be confident that as we move to 100% renewable energy system, that battery storage together with pump hydro will be able to play a very significant role in actually ensuring that we continue to see energy reliability and energy security. But traditionally, we've probably had only about 100 or so large-scale generators in the Australian grid. So it's been relatively easy to coordinate them. When we are starting to think about having very large numbers of residential batteries or electric vehicles moving around, we have to now think about how we might be able to manage millions or tens of millions of these assets. And so thinking about, how do we communicate to these assets? How do we get them to share the data? How do we get them to participate in the market is becoming a really significant challenge. So I think this really points out to the broader role of what we think as kind of grid integration. If you think about how we get out of the assets that we are seeing deployed in our grids, whether it's different forms of renewable generation, wind or solar, we're getting solar on people's rooftops. We're getting lots of different forms of battery storage in our grid, and electric vehicles, of course. How do we coordinate them out? How do we optimize how they should all behave and interact so that we actually get the best outcome for everybody? So that's something, I guess that's going to keep us busy for many years to come. So now we are going to have another Q&A break. So feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat if you have any questions.
Great, we've got one hand raised already. So Thang Nguyen from Vietnam, if you want to ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you
Yes,
hear
we
me?
can.
Yes, can hear you very well.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I have some questions. The first about related to the modeling, the best model. So I wonder in here is the experience from the modeling with the pump hydro storage. It means you try to do the build the model is overfitting or underfitting to test the characteristic of the best to see the reaction of them when the grid inits is the first question. The second question related to the ancillary service. You also talk about the application of that in the presentation. So I just wonder how do you select what type of service the best will provide in the system? It will be provide like the participate in the frequency control, or it will provide the transmission service. Is the second question. The third question relate to the application of the with the EV. So I wonder in here that I not see that you mentioned to the EV charging station, but you also want have the best. So in you choose with them differently, like for the battery for transportation, or even we have the same requirement when connected to the grid and the battery for the large one. And the last one that you could use as a report or the academic journal relate to the some result for connecting best into the grid. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. That's quite a lot of questions. My apologies, I didn't quite catch the first question. Would you mind repeating that? The first question?
Tang, are you able to just repeat the first question?
My first question relates to the modeling, the best model, because I want to ask from the experience do modeling with the pump hydro storage. So you should choose the overfitting or underfitting model for best to test the characteristic when connecting the best into the grid. I mean that if we do it too complex, it will be very hard and need to modeling all the system. So because we not sure that which service of the best will provide.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. So when we're modeling the integrating pump hydro into the system, so first we are considering an 100% renewable electricity system. Most of the energy is from solar photovoltaics and wind. We also consider some existing hydro and biothermal that helps to providing some flexible generation. And pump hydro on top of that will be used as a main storage mechanism to balance the supply and the demand. So we've done the modeling for a few countries, starting with Australia, and then Japan, and also countries in ASEAN and South Asia. So one common, the most common storage requirement we found, as this touched on in the presentation, was that you probably need about 20 gigawatt hour of storage per million people, or roughly 1 or 2 days of storage. So that's basically, that's the feature of an electricity system that is dominated by variable solar or photovoltaics, because in any case, you will need to store solar during the daytime when you have access to electricity, and then recover it during the night when there's no solar or when there's no wind. So that means you've got 5 to 6 hours of storage. And also the system will occasionally suffer from continued periods of low solar and wind availability. So if you imagine that there's a week and this continued cloudy and there's no wind blowing, so that is the week that actually drives up the system cost. So it's really important that you model the system over a long time period. So you make sure that you capture these historical extreme events to be able to reliably size the amount of storage you need. Because if normally one storage capacity might be work for 99% of the time, but if only 1% of the time is not enough, then the grid will fail. So you have to scale up your storage for that 1% of the time when it's the most stressful. And just regarding the second question, you mentioned how to select the correct size of the pump hydro for the electricity grid. So I think that's a great question. So in terms of the national grid, I think you certainly need a lot of pump hydro sites. The good news is that we have a lot of potential, so you only need 1% of the identified potential. But then in terms of which pump hydro needs to be built first, I guess I probably don't have a very clear answer to that, because you can actually look at the atlas and look for the class A sites. All of these sites needs to have a detailed engineering evaluation. You have to send people to the site to evaluate if that's actually feasible to be able to build a site there. So you need to do a few feasibility analysis. You need to go through the social license. You need to go through the government regulations. So I guess you've got a lot of options, but I'm not sure which one you're going to build first. And the third question you asked about, sorry, could you please just repeat the third question?
The third question I asked about the EV, because I'm not see you mentioned about the EV charging station. So I wonder that you will be treated with the EV for the I mean the battery for transportation is different or is the same, the battery when for integration of renewable energy when related to the connect to the grid requirement.
Right. So in our previous modeling, we consider EV as an additional flexible load. So if you consider the historical electricity demand is rather inflexible, because people will have to use electricity in the morning. They will have to use electricity during the evening peak, 7, 8 p.m., for example. That is something you cannot change. But for EV, you have a large battery, so you can charge at any time you want, because the EV battery now is about 80, 70 kilowatt hour. That's roughly, the range covered is roughly enough for almost 1 week's travel. So you can charge like which day you wanted to charge, which time of day you wanted to charge. So there's a lot of flexibility in the EV demand. And the way we model that was to create a range of profiles that represent different charging behaviors and to see how that will affect the system cost. And if you remember, we have one of the worst charger scenario where all the people charge EV during the evening peak, which it happens to be when people use the most energy, and that will greatly drive up the system cost. But if all other scenarios other than that will only increase the system cost by 4 to 8%. And so that study will only consider the broader grid. We didn't really consider the transmission, we considered the transmission network, but not the distribution network. So if you have 100% uptake of electric vehicles, you definitely have a lot of distributed load. You will certainly need to update the distribution network to be able to cope with the higher peak loads during the evening peaks.
And of course, the last question there, Cheng, was about the papers. So maybe that's something that could be put on Moodle, some reference papers that the ones that you've referred to of your own work and others around storage. If we could add that onto the Moodle site so that people can see the actual references.
Sure. At the end of this session, I will upload a list of all the resources covered in this session.
There was, sticking with your Hornsdale, you gave the example of Hornsdale, the large battery on the Australian grid providing ancillary services. There was a question related about grid batteries from the earlier session from Trung, who said one of the issues in Vietnam is the curtailment of solar and wind power, i.e. the surplus. In this context, is pumped hydro storage applicable? So this is specifically, Cheng, relating to an area in South Central Vietnam where you have solar farms of tens of megawatt installed capacity, and they're not able to evacuate the electricity to the grid, and suffering some curtailment. So can you use the pumped hydro storage in such an application to store, or is battery a better option? What do you think for that kind of scale? Yeah,
I think so. Technically, both pumped hydro and battery can be used to shift, to be able to mitigate the curtailment issue. But from the economic perspective, pumped hydro is definitely much better than battery, because if you remember the different power and energy ratings of batteries and the pumped hydro, actually you can have a very large battery with the same capacity as pumped hydro. You can operate the battery similar to pumped hydro twice a day, or 180 time cycles per year. That's technically possible, but that will be very, very expensive, and no one will do that. So pumped hydro is the cheapest type of storage when we are talking about 5 to 6 hours of storage, and that's exactly what the a grid with solar PV needs. So you store excess electricity in the pump hydro, or the curtailed electricity in the pump hydro, and then use that during the night. You can also do that with battery, but it would be very expensive. Battery is more economic when it's less than 2 hours of storage.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And a related question was coming in also from some colleagues in the Philippines. Mm-hmm. So this, and I think you showed a graph about this earlier on, about the size of what size makes these different technologies economically feasible. So is there a minimum size, for example, that pumped hydro needs to be economically feasible? And is there sort of a maximum size for battery storage in which beyond that it's no longer economically feasible to use batteries? So probably a related question to what you've just answered, but if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure. I actually came across a graph actually showing exactly, so the vertical axis is the levelized cost of storage, and the horizontal axis is the storage hour. And you can clearly see at which region the pump hydro is cheaper, at which region the battery is cheaper. So from memory, battery is cheaper when it's below 2 hours of storage, and pump hydro is much cheaper, about 3 to 4 hours of storage.
Yeah.
So I would try to look for that graph, and if possible, I'll add that to the course website after this session.
Great. That would be great. I think that's very relevant for all of the 3 countries who are exploring at the moment lots of different options for storage. So
indeed, so battery and pump hydro are actually very complementary. It's not one or the other. They're both that can provide the lowest cost storage solution.
Okay, and there was also some questions around other kinds of storage technology. So, yep. And they were relating also to the environmental issues. So one question from Isabello, who's from University of San Carlo, he asked about, given the environmental issues for pumped hydro, what's the economic outlook for other similar systems like gravity energy storage, energy vault, who are using these concrete blocks up and down? And then the related question is, what are the environmental, or what are the disadvantages, environmental or otherwise, for redox flow batteries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do have seen a few other energy storage that utilizes the gravitational difference, like using the a concrete block. But I don't think that has been deployed in large scale yet. I'm not sure about the actual cost of that. So one important reason why pump hydro is the dominant type of energy storage at the moment is because it is cheap. So if other storage technology can keep with can be as cheap as pump hydro, then of course there's a huge potential for them. But if not, people will just choose the cheapest type of storage. And the reason we look into off-river pump hydro is that it mitigates a lot of the environmental issues with the on-river systems, because you don't need to worry about damage to the rivers or the lakes. And regarding the environmental impact of the batteries, I think that's a great question. And in fact, speaking of the recycling of the battery, we don't have a large scale recycling industry with a large capacity yet. But the good news is that we are seeing a lot of the manufacturers that they are providing a whole life cycle management. So if you purchase battery from them, and then at the end of the lifetime, you will then send the battery back to them, and they will manage the recycling of the battery. I think we're just starting to see the first chunk of battery going towards the end of their life. So it's going to be an interesting thing to look into how the recycling of the battery could be managed to avoid the damaged environment.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think just to ask that question one more time, I may have misrepresented it there, Cheng. The question was really for redox flow batteries. What are the main disadvantages that you see for the redox flow, whether it's to do with the toxicity of the materials or the environmental issues or low energy density or otherwise? What do you see are the disadvantages facing redox flow batteries?
Yeah, I think the biggest advantage is that it's not in the commercial scale yet. So it's not as lithium. So as with lithium battery and solar PV and wind, there's a learning curve. The more you deploy, the lower the cost is. So you need to have a few years to be able to deploy a technology in large scale to make the technology economically competitive. And with the flow battery, I think it's just at a very early stage. A lot of research going on, but not very large deployment yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and if we maybe a chance for a couple, three last questions. Mm-hmm. So one's on vehicles, EVs and EV batteries, or yep. Two are on these. One is related to the impact of EV to grid on the battery life. Is there a significant deterioration in battery life from that? And the second is, if your EV vehicle is being charged on a grid that's dominated by coal, is there still an argument, like a decarbonization argument for electrifying EVs in that country?
Yeah, okay. So I think the first, both questions are great. Just regarding the first question, I guess you were talking more about the charging, so sending energy from the battery to the grid. So I actually see a lot of conflicting studies that talking about this issue. Some studies are talking about the vehicle to grid will affect the lifetime of the battery, or the others talking about that the impact is very small. So I think it's still at the early stage because there is no very large scale vehicle to grid projects yet. So this is still under debate, and most of the resources currently are just the academic studies. So I don't have a very clear answer to that. I think we might see a clear answer to that in the next decade or so when that's actually deployed in large quantities. And just regarding the second question, I think that's a very good point. If the electricity is provided by coal and then using the non-clean electricity to power EV is clearly not a good option, because that will still so EV will introduce additional electricity demand. So if you do not decarbonize the electricity grid in the first place, it means that you will need to build more coal or natural gas plants to be able to cope with that increasing demand. And that will lead to increasing emissions. Whether that emission will be offset by the reduction in emissions when you switch from gas line to electricity, I'm not 100% sure, but that's clearly not something we wanted to, that's not the future trend. We wanted to have an 100% renewable electricity grid, and then before we have 100% uptake of the electric vehicles.
Great, okay. Thanks, Jen. I think, do you want to pass back to you to go on to the next section, and I'll have a quick scan of the comments to see if there's any that I've missed in the questions.
Of course. So, just moving on to the third topic. So now we've talked about pumped hydro, we talked about battery, and now we'll introduce hydrogen as another way to store energy. Although hydrogen for energy storage, or I should say hydrogen for electricity storage, is probably not the best option. I'll talk more about that very soon. So if we look again at this energy-related emissions by sector, and we know that power generation, transport, and industries represent a majority of emissions globally. And as we've discussed earlier, 100% renewable electricity and electrification is the viable pathway to decarbonize pretty much the entire energy sector. But also I've touched on very briefly earlier that there are sectors that are difficult to be directly electrified, like the iron and steel industry, chemicals and cement, and also freight transport. And also hydrogen can provide this opportunity to convert renewable energy into a source that can help to decarbonize these sectors that are difficult to be directly electrified. So hydrogen can be produced from water. Hydrogen is very light, and so it's not available in pure form in nature. And we need this process to generate pure hydrogen that we need for various applications. So I will talk about the electrolysis technology in a moment, but basically it requires this energy to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. But then when we are burning the hydrogen, this process will generate energy. And the good point about that is that there's no carbon associated with this process because it's just water vapor that will come out of the process with energy released, of course. So in terms of the properties of hydrogen, there are a couple of important points. So the first is that the energy per unit of mass of hydrogen is quite high. It's 3 times that of gas line. But on the other side, on the opposite side, the energy density of hydrogen is quite low. It's only 1/3 of natural gas. So that's an issue we need to address. So hydrogen could be produced from the electrolyzer using a process called water electrolysis. Again, I'm not going to talk about the chemistry here, but the basic idea is that the water is split into hydrogen and oxygen with the presence of the electric current. So currently there are 2 major types of electrolyzers, alkaline and PEM electrolyzer. So with the current technology, you will need about 70 kilowatt hours of electricity to produce 1 kilogram of hydrogen. But we're expecting to see the efficiency increase so that energy requirement reduced to less than 45 kilowatt hour by 2050. And it's worth pointing out that the currently majority of the hydrogen is not produced via water electrolysis. Instead, it's produced from fossil fuels, natural gas and coal. So, but since we are heading towards the zero emission energy sector, these technologies would definitely need to be replaced. And on the other end of the process, we need a technology to basically help us to extract the energy from the hydrogen. And this is usually done in a fuel cell, which generate electricity from the electrochemical processes. And this energy can be used for heat or for other applications such as fuel cell vehicles or for power generation. So this graph summarizes the power to X options, which means that the power from the solar and wind can be used for hydrogen production via water electrolysis, and the produced hydrogen is then used for a variety of a wide range of applications. So we're starting with the gas grid. This option is basically to decarbonize the gas grid by blending either pure hydrogen or methanol that is produced from hydrogen into the grid. We'll talk about hydrogen derivatives like methanol in a second. So basically, the hydrogen or methanol is used where the gas is used for heat or for power generation. You can think about this like another form of energy storage. So electricity generated from wind and solar is stored in the hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives, and then you can recover that energy at a later time. So in that sense, it can also provide seasonal storage. So if you store the excess electricity from solar summer and then use it in winter to heat your home, so probably not particularly the case for Australia or Southeast Asia, but could be very useful for Europe when they have very cold winter. And the second option is the industry which needs high temperature heat, and hydrogen can also be used as the feedstock. So it can directly replace the fossil fuel that are currently used in the industry, and it can be used for producing particularly products like the iron pellets. And also briefly talked about the heavy transport and freight transport. So particularly hydrogen can help with that and to decarbonize the transport sector, especially heavy transport. Although the batteries in electric vehicles, as we just discussed, are likely to be a more promising option for light-duty vehicles and for land transport. But for freight and light heavy-duty vehicles, and also shipping and aviation, hydrogen can provide this opportunity to decarbonize this sector, because these heavy-duty vehicles would otherwise need a very, very large and heavy battery pack. So e-fuels and hydrogen derivatives are another potential application of hydrogen. They are basically hydrogen hydrocarbon fuels synthesized from hydrogen and CO2 or nitrogen. So basically, they are good for the climate because they also extract carbon dioxide from the air. So basically, they are another type of zero carbon energy carrier. Of course, if the hydrogen is produced from renewable energy in the first place. They can be very helpful because they have very good properties, very similar to the fossil fuel counterparts, because they have very high energy density. They are much easier to store, to transport, and if you compare that with hydrogen, which has low energy density. And also there are a wide range of applications, including chemical feedstock, power generation, fertilizer production, and so on. But on the other hand, there are some critical challenges. The main issue is the efficiency. So basically, if you're starting with 100 units of electricity sent to the electrolyzer, you first lose 20% during water electrolysis. So 73% is roughly the current efficiency of electrolyzer. And then the compression and also the fuel cell. And in the end, we get to around 29% or 29 units out of 100. So basically around 30% efficiency. And if you consider the other option of power to gas, so blending hydrogen with natural gas or converting it to methanol and then blend it with natural gas, we get to around 21 to 26%. So overall, these energy storage options are only about 20 to 30% efficient. So there is a big loss of energy in all these processes. And as a comparison, pumped hydro is 80% efficient and battery is 85 to 90% efficient. So it's very unlikely that hydrogen will be able to compete with pumped hydro and battery in terms of providing energy storage. And also some more information in certain applications. For example, we can look into the transport, and currently the conventional vehicles are running on the 30% efficiency, while the electric vehicles are running at around 86% efficiency. It's a massive increase, and that's why there's some significant trend towards the electrification of light-duty vehicles. But if you think about using hydrogen to power fuel cell vehicles, and if you consider all the process to produce the hydrogen, to compress the hydrogen, and the efficiency of the electrolyzer, the efficiency of the fuel cell, whether the hydrogen is produced from renewable energy via water electrolysis, or it's produced from fossil fuel via carbon capture and storage, the efficiency is only 41 to 44%, so significantly less than the efficiency of electric vehicles. If you look at residential heating, electric heat pump is extremely efficient in terms of the heating our homes or heating the water. The efficiency can range between 230 to 410%, depending on the ambient temperature. So the higher the ambient temperature, the higher the efficiency of the heat pump. But if we blend hydrogen into the gas grid and use the gas heaters, the efficiency is only 62%. So basically, hydrogen has a lot of applications, and many people are calling it sort of the Swiss Army knife, with a wide range of applications, from power generation to balancing energy system as a storage mechanism, and for seasonal balancing, and for industrial heating and mid to low temperature heating, and for various types of transport. So there's a lot of applications, but at the same time, we need to be very careful that there are other options that are likely to be more energy efficient and much cheaper. So it's really critical to understand where hydrogen is competitive and where it's not. So there are people have looked into different options and different applications of hydrogen, and they created this hydrogen ladder. So if you look at this ladder of hydrogen, you can see that hydrogen is more useful for fertilizer, for long distance aviation shipping, because it's just difficult to find another zero emission alternative for these end users. While on the other side of the ladder, hydrogen for land transport is difficult to compete with electric vehicles. Hydrogen for energy storage is difficult to compete with pumped hydro and batteries. Hydrogen for residential heating is difficult to compete with heat pumps. So it's important to make sure that the hydrogen industry is built around these sectors, which will be in which the hydrogen will actually be competitive. So that's a very brief introduction of hydrogen. So now I'm ready to take other questions.
Thanks a lot, Cheng. That's really interesting. I like the Swiss Army knife and the ladder analogy at the end there. The ladder one is very useful, I think, as countries think through the role that hydrogen will play. I think there's so many options, and it's hard to kind of to think about it systematically, like the way the ladder presents it.
Yeah.
Okay, so if anyone's got a question, if you raise your hand, you get to jump to the front of the queue in asking the question. So please, if you want to ask the question directly, raise your hand and we can unmute you so you can ask it. Otherwise, please do continue to add the questions into the chat. One question on hydrogen, there's a couple of pumped hydro questions in there still, but one question on hydrogen that I would like to start with is, often with other storage technologies, we hear a lot about the learning curve and how the cost of the technology is decreasing rapidly. Hydrogen, is hydrogen in the same kind of situation? Or, we know we've had electrolyzer technology for some time. So is it something that the cost of hydrogen is going to decrease, rapidly over time, as we've seen for batteries or for solar PV cells? Or will it be something that is not following that same path?
I think certainly the cost of hydrogen production will decrease, but to what extent we are not sure, because it's slightly different with solar PV and battery or wind, because there are two components of the hydrogen production cost. One is the cost of the electrolyzer. So that's one equipment. With more deployment, certainly the cost will reduce. The current cost of electrolyzer is about $2,000 to $3,000 per kilowatt of the Australian dollars, and people are expecting it to reduce to $500 per kilowatt in the next decade. But the issue with hydrogen is that in addition to the electrolyzer cost, you still have the cost of the electricity that is used to produce the hydrogen, and that depends on the cost of solar and wind and storage, for example. And so, so the electrolyzer has capacity factor, which means that if you operate that over a long time, if you keep it operating 24/7, and then the levelized cost of hydrogen will be reduced because the capital cost will be spread over a larger hydrogen production. But with variable renewable energy, the electrolyzer may not be able to operate at the full capacity at all times. So you need to include the cost of the storage to be able to provide a steady electricity supply to the electrolyzer. So that's some additional cost. So I think in terms of the hydrogen production cost, I think I'm more optimistic. I think there are researchers at the ANU talking about $2 per kilo by 2030, and I think that's very likely. But another issue with the hydrogen is that it's not just to produce hydrogen. After that, you need to compress it, you need to ship it, and then it needs to go through the fuel cell, for example, for combustion. And there's a lot of efficiency loss. That's something that's very hard to improve. So if you consider the cost from the end use perspective, that will not reduce very significantly. But just the hydrogen itself, from the production perspective, I think there's a huge potential for cost reduction.
Yeah, there's a comment there about, for colleagues in Vietnam. Vietnam has been going through a planning process, their power development planning process, and there's a comment there from one of the Vietnamese colleagues who's sort of shown what the plan is in terms of hydrogen in the comment box, and they said that it's basically a plan of LNG plants gradually shifting to switching the fuel from LNG to hydrogen. Can you maybe comment a little bit on that process of, if you've got a LNG power station and you're switching it to hydrogen, some of these costs or some of these considerations about efficiency and timing when costs might come down? How quickly should such a process take place? And yeah, what are some of the efficiency considerations we should be thinking about?
Yeah, that's a great point to consider, because if you blend hydrogen into the LNG grid, of course it reduces emission, but on the basis that the hydrogen is produced from renewable energy. So currently, I would say about over 90% of the hydrogen is not produced from renewable energy. It's not from water electrolysis, it's from fossil fuels. So it makes no difference to blend a blue or gray hydrogen to the LNG grid, and that doesn't have a very long-term impact in terms of the emissions. In the future, hydrogen could be produced from fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage, but that carbon capture and storage is still at a very early stage. There is no large-scale projects yet, so not a very established technology. So I think that's a good trend, because it's eventually, although we've been talking about hydrogen not very efficient for the heating or for providing for power generation, but there's a good trend to replace hydrogen if that's green hydrogen generated from renewables, to replace the gas that still reduces some of this emission.
Okay, a couple of other hydrogen questions. One, and colleague Pauline from Philippines, Pauline Ferreira, please correct if I've got this question wrong, but if hydrogen turns out actually to be less efficient, what could be some hidden profitable ventures? So I think the question is what kinds of businesses might emerge that could make hydrogen more efficient?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, but one that I don't have a clear answer to, because we look at the different power to power or power to gas processes, and there are a lot of processes involved in that. For example, you have energy lost through the electrolyzer, you have the energy lost through the fuel cell, you have the energy lost through the compression shipping. So I think it's very difficult to have a significant increase in the overall efficiency of this entire process. But for individual components, like I mentioned earlier, the electrolyzer efficiency is expected to increase. Now we need 70 kilowatt hour for 1 kilogram of hydrogen. In the future, we only need 45 kilowatt hour. We probably will see an increase in the fuel cell efficiency or the compression efficiency, but because there are so many components in the process, the overall efficiency is hard to compete with battery or pump hydro.
And Ms. Ferreira has just clarified her question a little bit, so I understand better now, Cheng. If the hydrogen is so much less efficient than the other forms of storage that we've been discussing and talking about, what's the big attraction? Why is there a big attraction for hydrogen? What's its real benefit?
That's a great question. I think a lot of people who are advocate for the hydrogen are from the fossil fuel industry, because they would need very little infrastructure to come to, for example, people who are in the natural gas industry, there's a very small infrastructure update for them to switch from natural gas to hydrogen. But if we are talking about a grid that's supplied mostly by PV and wind, it's actually means a loss in market share for them. And also there are also in Japan, a lot of the car manufacturers are proposing the fuel cell vehicles because they have put in, over the past decade, they put in so many research and development into the fuel cell vehicles. So they wanted to get a certain amount of market share in the future. They don't want it to a future where there's 100% electric vehicles or 100% solar and wind.
Mm.
That's my understanding. Not sure if that's correct or not.
Yeah, so it's an easier transition. There's less aspects along the chain that have to be changed, and there's players already who are comfortable in doing those, in providing similar kinds of fuels that could switch it out.
Yeah, exactly.
Another question about hydrogen is about its energy density. So a colleague from Indonesia has asked that they've learned that hydrogen has a low energy density in terms of low energy density and can be stored in many forms. So what are the best ways of storing hydrogen?
That's a great question. So currently the most popular way to store hydrogen is to liquefy that, so that hydrogen will be liquefied and stored in the tanks. So I think earlier this year or late last year, there was a ship that from Australia to Japan that ships hydrogen in tanks to export hydrogen from Australia to Japan. So although the hydrogen was not produced from renewable energy, it's not a clean hydrogen, but it shows that how hydrogen could be stored and shipped in a safe manner. But also there are other technologies like underground storage of hydrogen, or as we've discussed earlier, we can convert hydrogen into hydrogen derivatives, methane, methanol, ammonia, which have much higher energy density, much easier to store, much easier to be transported.
Great. One last question I think is on there from a colleague in Philippines. Can you share with the group the cost of producing electricity using the different technologies you've discussed earlier? So some kind of comparison of the costs and competitiveness of the different technologies. Is it
right? That's a good question. So we've done some modeling for Australia, as we mentioned earlier. So one study, so when we do that study, the cost of solar and wind was pretty high. We were using $50 per megawatt hour for both solar, PV, and wind, and now that's reduced to 30 to 40. But let's just use $50, and we calculate the cost to balance variable solar and wind to meet the demand on an hourly basis. That includes the cost of the storage, the cost of the high voltage transmission to connect different areas, and the cost of occasional spillage of the electricity. The curtailment. You have to sometimes overbuild solar and wind capacity, because that's the lowest cost solution. So that balancing cost is 25 Australian dollars per megawatt hour. So in total, $75 per megawatt hour in Australian dollars for the wholesale electricity price. But then you need to consider the cost of the distribution networks, the profit of the retailers. So that's different from the price that people pay for electricity in their homes. But the wholesale price is about $75 per megawatt hour, and that's for Australia, that cost will certainly reduce, I think. But that also depends on the local characteristics, because we've also done analysis for Japan. Japan doesn't have good solar. The solar and wind resource in Japan is not as good as that in Australia. It's a lower capacity factor, so it costs more to generate electricity from solar, PV, and wind in Japan than in Australia. And that cost is around $90 US dollars per megawatt hour. But that was still lower than the current wholesale electricity price in Japan, which is from a fossil fuel-based system. And all of these systems were modeling using pumped hydro as the primary energy storage, but we haven't model a system with battery as a primary storage yet, but the cost might be a bit higher. But as I mentioned earlier, the cost of battery is still reducing, so I'm a bit optimistic about that. So, and just a final point regarding if you wanted to entirely replace pumped hydro with hydrogen as the primary energy storage, the cost is close to $300 per megawatt hour. Very, very expensive because of the low efficiency.
Yeah. So that also, I guess, that's also a reason why hydrogen could be considered, in that you can produce the hydrogen in countries where you have a high renewable resource and it's cheap form of electricity, and then export the hydrogen to countries where the renewables are not so abundant or more expensive. Exactly. So it's sort of like a tradable commodity in that sense.
Yeah, exactly. But you have to consider the trade-off between the lower cost of electricity and the cost of shipping and transport. So it could be a very important industry that hydrogen replaces be a main factor of the global energy trade that replaces natural gas.
Great. Cheng, thank you very much. I think we've gotten through all the questions. Apologies if I have missed any in the chats there, but we do of course have the Moodle platform to continue the discussion and answer other questions as they come up. We also can use it as a way to chat, because I know there's lots of people in the group here who have experience with exploring energy storage in your country, so you can share that experience with each other through the Moodle chat. Cheng, if you haven't any final comments to make, or we pass back to Dr. Tang for the close of the session.